Well, I've had an association with both the student Christian movement in the long distant past, but I owe a great deal to it for opening up my world and student days. And I've had contact with the fellowship as well, of course. Um, when Jack asked me to make a presentation to you folks, I thought I would just share with you something I've been working with other people in the more recent past. You know, I was very much involved in the leading up to the Good Friday Agreement and what followed from that, particularly with the decommissioning of the weapons of the IRA, which was a big step forward in our peace process. So we were very pleased with the progress we made, but we're very deeply conscious as time has gone on that that's only a beginning. When you have a peace agreement, it's really just a starting point rather than an end point, because we realize that we have to, what we call, deal with the past. I'm not sure I like the phrase dealing with the past. It sounds like you're negotiating, and I'm not sure that's how we make peace, but it's the phrase that we tend to use, dealing with the past. How do we deal with the past? Right. So when we talk about the past, here in Northern Ireland, we're not just talking about the last 40, 50 years. When we talk about the past, we realize more and more we're dealing with centuries of conflict. We are the inheritors of the past. And our recent conflict is because we didn't deal properly with the past. Historians will tell us that 90% of the conflicts in our world of today can be attributed to unresolved conflict of the past. That to me is a hugely challenging and sobering thought, that 90% of the conflict in our world of today can be directly attributed to unresolved conflicts of the past. And that's certainly been true of our history. I just listed a number of the things that represent the dreadful moments of the past on our small island. It goes back to the famine and beyond it, the plantation of Ulster, the flight of the Earls, the Civil War of the 1920s, the evictions of the 19th century. You know, those are just some of the headlines. The penal laws of 1695, those have all, they're all a part of the past that was never properly dealt with and never resolved. And that's why we have had to live through yet another cycle of violence. And the same can be true, I'm sure, of almost every place of conflict in our world of today. The more recent past that we're deeply conscious of is the violence of the 1930s, and then again in the 1950s, and yet again in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and into the 21st century. And you'll be familiar with that from the headlines and the stories that you saw recorded and what you know from your own experience. Have some of you been in Northern Ireland at any of the study tours that we've had? No, you have, Paul. Yeah. So you'll be familiar with some of the tragic stories. During that period of time, from 66 to 2006, there have been 370 something deaths, 16,000 bombings, 37,000 shootings, and 47.5 people injured. We're a very small geographically and numerically, we're a small community of 1.6 million people. So those statistics represent a sizable percentage of the families in our community who have been deeply, directly affected by the violence. When we talk about learning from the past, I'm sure many of you, like myself, have been to Auschwitz, and you will maybe remember the harrowing experience. But on the wall of the extermination chamber, they called it, what a dreadful name. The one who does not remember history is bound to live through it again. Those words ring so true in so many of our situations of conflict. If we do not learn from our history, is what it means. If we do not learn from our history, we are bound to live through it again. So how do we deal with our past? Whether it be here on the island of Ireland, not just Northern Ireland, but the whole island of Ireland, or anywhere, any situation that has been embroiled in bloody conflict and horror and division. How do we begin to deal with the past? Our Good Friday Agreement was dealing largely with the future, how we were to address issues of political issues, of principles of consent, commitment to exclusively peaceful means, a new political process, equality, human rights, reform of policing and decommissioning of weapons. But in that list of priorities from our Good Friday Agreement was a section on victims and survivors. And that rightly so, because that's to deal with the past. All those other issues are to deal with where do we go from here for the future. And we've been learning that we cannot really have a future in which we have confidence if we do not address the hurt and the pain of the past. And so I tend to use the phrase healing the hurts rather than dealing with the past. How do we heal the hurts? And we are learning very, very clear to us, becoming even more clear as we become embroiled in conflicts, verbal conflict and dispute and debate, that until we somehow or other adequately address the hurt and the pain of the past, we cannot really move forward to the future for which we yearn. So how do we deal with the past? I gave you some statistics earlier there about the numbers of people, but it's now been established pretty clearly that 40,000 people have suffered permanent physical or psychological damage. And in a relatively small community, that represents not just individuals, but families. So you can multiply the 40,000 by many more. Households affected, it's reckoned 100,000 households have been affected. None of us, or I should say every one of us, will know somebody, some family, some individual who has been very directly affected, if not ourselves, others. Recent public health surveys suggest as many as 1 in 3 people have been affected directly or indirectly by the violence of the recent past. How do we deal with this hurt and pain? Because until we do, we will still be locked in to our past, which prevents us from moving to a new future. One approach is to say, let's draw a line under the past. And many people would say that and propose that, just let's draw a line under it. That's all right if you haven't been directly affected by it, but you can't really go to a widow or to people who as children, lost a father or a mother, a brother or a sister, and say, let's just draw a line under it. That's not so easy if you have directly been affected, or your family, or you're part of the community. To draw a line under it is much too simplistic a solution. So we've ruled that out. And some of the other amnesty has been suggested. International law does not actually allow for amnesty. And there are many other solutions that people have suggested, and every one of them has some kind of a problem in terms of implementing it. So say amnesty, we've looked at it and think, so how do we heal? Come back to this question, how do we heal the hurt? By the way, that picture is taken up in Connemara, and that is called the Famine Cross. It's a cross to remind us of one of the worst incidents during the famine in Ireland. And so I chose that as a background because it reminds us again of some of the pain of the past, which has contributed to the pain of the present. I address many different kinds of audiences. Many of them are people from within the faith community. Many of them are not. And many of them have a mixture of both people of faith and people who would not confess to having a faith perspective, a conscious faith perspective in their lives. So I try to find words that will resonate with people who come from different perspectives. But many of us who are from within the faith perspective and faith community, we ask ourselves, what do we have to bring to this discussion? What do we have to bring to the table when we talk about dealing with the past and finding a way forward from our hurt and our pain, which will allow us to live more freely together in a new atmosphere and in a new community? Is there anything distinctive that we can bring to the conversation? And when there's been hurt and pain and conflict in the family, in the church, in the neighborhood, in society, in the world, and if we truly and seriously and genuinely want to find a resolution, what is there something we can offer and bring to the conversation? I think that the first thing I suggest is confession. That's a word very central in our vocabulary. We begin our act of worship on a Sunday morning in most of our traditions by saying, I confess to you, my brothers and sisters, in what I have said and left unsaid, and what I have done and what I have left undone. You're familiar with the words within your own tradition if we are people who attend worship. Those very, very, very powerful words. Sadly, I think we very often just repeat them without pausing to really ask ourselves, what does it really mean to confess to my brothers and sisters, to confess to all the people who I may have hurt knowingly and unknowingly. And I say in some of these audiences to which I address, if that word is a bit too churchy for anybody, let's just talk about honesty. Let's talk about honesty. And recently I've been involved with others in struggling with the whole question of the legacy. How do we, address the legacy of our conflict? And the word that many people are using, which seems to be a very universally acceptable word, is acknowledgement. And whether we call it confession or acknowledgement or honesty, it's all saying the same thing. And in any situation of conflict, if we are serious about resolving that conflict, um, we need to begin by being honest and truthful and acknowledging our part in that conflict. I Googled, I just put in public apologies, and I got 73 public apologies recorded. And I've just put down some of them there, just a few of them. The IRA says sorry to civilian victims. The church apologies. Methodists apologize to native tribes, and that refers to something there at the bottom, Sand Creek Methodist Apology. It was in one of the southern states of America where Methodists had been guilty of abusive behavior towards Native Americans. And it was a running sore for many, many, many years. And at one of the conferences of the United Methodist Church, they made a very public apology, which was long overdue, but which helped to change, I'm told, the whole relationship between the church and the people in that community. Australia, sorry for child abuses. David Cameron apologizes for Bloody Sunday. And it includes lots of apologies. I've only just picked out a few of them there. Churches in Canada and in other places and in Ireland for the abuse of children who were taken into care, and just have many tragic, awful, dreadful stories. And these are just some of the apologies, and rightly so. It's only the beginning of the healing of hurt, and we're going through it here in Ireland at the moment with the stories of young women who were taken into convents and laundries, and their children taken from them. And in fact, many of the children dying through lack of proper care, and the churches having to apologize, and some of the awful stories of abuse across our churches, not any one tradition. South Africa, and I was interested to come across what did the churches in South Africa have to confess during that terrible period of apartheid. And they have listed their acts, this is they themselves have listed their acts of commission and their acts of omission. I was struck by this quotation: "We should have seen, but we didn't. We should have spoken, but we remained silent. We have acted, but we were afraid." Or we should have acted, but we were afraid. From the United Church of Christ in Japan, I was interested to find these words. Long time after the Second World War, they made this statement. During the war, during that time of World War II, we made a statement in which we approved of and supported the war, and we prayed for victory. Indeed, as our nation committed errors, we as a church sinned with her. Now, with deep regret in our heart, we confess this sin, seeking the forgiveness of our Lord, and from churches and our brothers and sisters of the world, and in particular of Asian countries. I referred earlier to David Cameron on behalf of the British government, apologizing to the victims and the families of the victims of the Bloody Sunday in Derry, which was a terrible, terrible moment in our history. And it took many, many years of inquiries and judges sitting over tribunals, etc., 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 before the British government did what it should really have done the first month after that event, was to apologize unreservedly, wholeheartedly for what the British Army did in Derry on that awful Sunday, which we call Bloody Sunday. And it has gone a long, long way towards healing hurt and pain. It's not over yet. In fact, this very day on which we meet and speak, one of the soldiers from that, the paratroopers, has been on trial for the murders of some of the people in Derry on that fateful day. But it took a long, long time for government to apologize for what happened on that day. And I found it interesting, that photograph is of the large screen in Guildhall Square, where David Cameron is addressing the people of Derry. And I found an almost identical picture of the Prime Minister of Australia on a large screen addressing people in Australia, apologizing and accepting responsibility on behalf of the country for what the crimes that they committed against the Aboriginal people in Australia. Interesting, isn't it? Look, the two pictures almost identical, and both situations, the prime ministers of each country making a public confession, not just an apology, but an acknowledgement and a confession for the wrongs that the state committed. In itself, it doesn't overnight make everything right, but it's a very important first step. In Australia, the statement that Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister, made said, "Today we take this first step by acknowledging this word again, the past, and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians." And now in Australia, they have, on the 26th of May, they have what they call a sorry day. A sorry day, when not just the Aboriginal people, but the stolen generations, as they call them, the children who were wronged and abused, a sorry day when the state, the country, comes together to acknowledge the hurt and the wrong of the past. I was interested to come across this photograph, which is skywriting over the Sydney Opera House and the bridge in the Sydney Harbour, saying sorry on that day. Somebody showed that picture to somebody recently, and they said, I hope the people who were in that plane were the people who had really committed the crimes. I'm not sure that was the case, but you see, do we have to share responsibility in the name of the communities of which we are a part? And I would contend that we do. People say to me, but sure, we weren't in Derry, we weren't a part of the history of injustice here in Northern Ireland. What have we to say sorry for? Maybe our parents and our grandparents didn't do things well, but surely we shouldn't have to apologize. And I think, and this is something we can talk about, I think we do have to take collective responsibility in our communities. So that's the first word: acknowledgement, honesty, confession, call it what you want, where we put our hands up and we accept responsibility for our part in the hurt and in the conflict. The second word that I offer is the word grace. And again, a word that comes from our distinctive vocabulary as people of faith. Grace, it's so central to our understanding of God and of his will for his people, and the way he cares and treats us, and how he asks us to treat one another. grace. Um, Again, I say to people in some of the audiences to which I speak, if you find that a little bit too churchy a word, let's just talk about generosity. Let's talk about being generous. What does it mean? I'm not sure generosity is adequate to cover what we would think of theologically as grace, but it says something of what's meant by grace. There's a picture of grace. The Queen, in a remembrance act with the representative of the German government beside her, at a service in London about 2 years ago. I think that photograph was taken. You know, we slaughtered each other in living memory, and certainly in my lifetime, if not in the lifetime of most of you who are watching. Could we ever have imagined that one day the Queen and the representative of the German people would come together in an act of worship to remember what we had done to one another at that period of time? It takes grace. Here's a picture of grace. Martin McGuinness, former commander of the IRA, the body of people responsible for the murder of Lord Mountbatten, the Queen's uncle, beloved uncle. And here they are. He greeting her on a visit to Belfast, and she greeting him. There's grace, isn't it? What an act of grace on her part to be able to put her hand in his hand. Ian Paisley would say he never shook hands with any of these people that he saw to be his enemies. The Queen actually showed grace where grace was lacking in other relationships. But there is another act of grace. Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, at the opening of the newly restored Stormont Assembly back in 2008. Ian Paisley, the man who said never, 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 never. And Martin McGuinness, center picture, former commander of the IRA, who told me his mother said he must never put his foot inside Stormont. To do so would be the ultimate betrayal of all that they believed in. And there, the two men who said never, going in, look at the hand of the younger man on the shoulder of the older man. One trying to guide the other, and the other accepting the hand of the old enemy. That took a lot of grace on that day, and I remember being there on that day, and the grace. Tony Blair used to talk about feeling the hand of history upon his shoulder, and I've often said, to me, this is the hand of history. And it took, and that was the beginning of a relationship that was very special to both of those people. But it took grace to take that first step, to go through that door. You may remember one of the most awful atrocities during our period of conflict was the massacre on Remembrance Sunday in Enniskillen in 1987. When a number of people who were standing at the cenotaph in a moment of remembrance, and a bomb exploded, killing 11 people. Amongst them, a young nurse called Mary Wilson, lovely, beautiful young girl. a Methodist family in Enniskillen that I knew very well. And that evening, Gordon, her father, spoke about how he lay under the rubble with his daughter Mary, reaching out their hands to each other. And the last words he heard from her were, "Daddy, I love you." Within an hour, she had died from her injuries, and he was quite badly injured as well, but not obviously mortally wounded. But he went on television that night. He was interviewed on television that night, and he said, I bear no ill will. I'm not going to get into dirty talk," was his phrase. "That will take us nowhere." And he used some words which he didn't say, "I forgive them," but his words were words that later people understood could only have come from somebody who understood the meaning of grace. The Queen took his words and included them in her Christmas Day message to the world. His message went around the world, a conciliatory word. It was a word of grace, even in the midst of his great, great grief and hurt and physical pain. The library in the golf resort is called the Gordon Wilson Library. Touched so many hearts, just touched so many hearts, because it was so different. Words of grace that came from somebody in that moment of time. There was another terrible atrocity on the Shankill Road in Belfast on a Saturday afternoon, a busy shopping road, and a bomb exploded in a shop. Just you can see the things there. And amongst the victims was a young girl called Sharon McBride. And there's Sharon with her husband, Alan, on their wedding day. And Sharon and her father, who was the proprietor of that shop, were killed in that appalling thing, as were several other people, including 2 children. What a ghastly, ghastly day. What a ghastly, unspeakable evil that was. Alan, her husband, understandably, was consumed with rage and anger, particularly when he saw Gerry Adams carrying the coffin of the bomber who had killed his wife amongst those other people. Can you imagine when he saw Gerry Adams carrying the coffin of the killer? Young Alan was just consumed with rage and understandably. He followed Gerry Adams to any public meeting where he heard Gerry Adams was speaking, and he shouted at him. He held up placards. He even went to New York to one of these Irish American rallies, and held up his placards and shouted abuse at Gerry Adams. He was just consumed with the thing. Time goes on, and I remember I was actually speaking at a Catholic church in West Belfast at an event, an annual event, and they'd invited people from across the community to this annual event, the West Belfast Festival. And in the congregation was Alan sitting, there he is, sitting up front. And at the back of the church was Gerry Adams. And I was speaking very much as I'm speaking now about how do we deal with the hurt and the pain of the past. And Alan came to me afterwards and said, I need to make my peace with Gerry Adams. I have to make my peace with Gerry Adams. I'm just consumed and I need to make my peace with him. will I go and speak to him now? And I said, no, Alan, I don't think you should, because there are too many cameras around, and there will be people who will circle around and listen to what you're saying. And I think if you do want to meet him, it needs to be in a private moment. And if you would like me to do so, I will invite him and you to come to my home some afternoon, and you can talk together quietly. And they did. And they did. And it was one of the most moving moments of my entire pastoral ministry to sit. Well, I just poured the tea. I poured the tea, and the two of them talked, and they came to a new understanding of each other and of what had happened in their lives, and particularly on that day. And Alan has now, he's one of our very significant peacemakers. How do you make peace? Alan's story is one of the ways in which we can learn how to make peace and find peace in ourselves, as well as make peace with others. It was a very, very moving experience indeed, and had a profound effect on both of them. Confession, honesty, acknowledgement, grace, forgiveness. I said that I often say to people, if you can find another word for confession and for grace that you find you're more comfortable with, fine. But you know what? I cannot find another word for forgiveness. I have vast audiences that I've spoken with what do you have another word for forgiveness? And nobody has yet given me another word for forgiveness. Some years ago, the Dalai Lama came to Belfast. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard the Dalai Lama speak, have you? He's quite a remarkable speaker. He's got tremendous charisma. And he speaks in staccato sentences. And each one of them is usually very profound. And he did that in a crowded public hall. And I was privileged to be one of those invited to hear him speak. And then there was a question and answer time. And somebody said to him, Your Holiness, what do you have to say to us about forgiveness? And I always remember his answer. He was silent for a moment. He looked to the ceiling and he looked to the floor. And then he said, Forgiveness? Who knows what forgiveness is? And he got a standing ovation, or not a standing ovation, but he got a huge ovation for his answer. And I thought, I wish I had that gift to say nothing and be applauded for it. And then I thought about it afterwards. I think his answer was profound. Who does know what forgiveness is? He could so easily have patted out something, as we often do ourselves, giving a pat answer to some profound question. But he was wise enough not to. Who knows what forgiveness is? Well, I think Jesus knew what forgiveness is. He taught us a lot about it. He spoke about it. But most of all, he was able, in his own moment of anguish, to say, forgive. Forgive. And the more I have thought about it, the more I've come to believe that the only people who are qualified to speak about forgiveness are those who have been forgiven or who have forgiven. For the rest of us, it's an academic conversation. What is forgiveness? When I want to know what forgiveness is, I ask somebody who I know has experienced forgiveness, either in the offering of it or in the receiving of it. And I suppose all of us have received forgiveness, so we are in some ways capable or qualified to speak to some extent about forgiveness. but who does know what forgiveness is? But what we do know from our faith perspective is that it is central to finding healing and to restore the brokenness. Mandela, powerful words. As I walked out of the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. The Amish people in nickel mines in Pennsylvania, you remember that awful atrocity where a gunman went in and murdered their children and then shot himself? The parents of those children started a fund to support the widow of the man who had murdered their children. And they stood with her and her children at the graveside as they buried the man who murdered their children. A newspaper journalist wrote a book, and I have it here on my shelf, where he says that he couldn't get his head around what these people were able to do at that moment. And he went back sometime later to try and find out. And they very simply said to him, "Isn't this what we have been taught? We've been taught to live this way in our families and in our community. So why should we abandon it now?" And you know, that has struck me as something that you can't just dismiss lightly. Confession, grace, and forgiveness. I said I would talk about the things that make for peace, and that's really a different presentation, but this is one I'm feeling very strongly about at the moment, as we here where I live are trying to find a way of restoring our relationships and dealing with our hurt and dealing with our pain and dealing with our past. And collectively, we are struggling to find out what it means to be honest, to acknowledge, and how do we live by grace, and most difficult of all, how do we find it in our hearts to forgive. So that's just something by way of, well, I always end with this picture, this picture of the rainbow. I'm always a little disappointed when I ask young people, what do you think of when you see a rainbow? And I get answers like rain or something like that. So many of our children now don't know these wonderful biblical stories. And the meaning and the significance of the symbol of the rainbow. But it's still held by people. And recently we had the NHS rightly applauded for what they have been doing for all of us. And the rainbow became a very powerful symbol. It's a symbol of hope, symbol of hope. And we've got to keep that hope. And I think that's something else that is something we have to bring to the table and to offer in these situations as we struggle to find how to restore and how to make peace and how to rebuild our lives and our communities. I hope that's in some way helpful. I don't know how long I've taken, probably far too long, but I hope, Jack, we've left the time for some conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Harold. That was really good to listen to. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, if you could put them in the chat, and then I'll read them to Harold.
Can we make the pictures bigger of ourselves now?
Yeah, so there you go. We should all be here. You strength in your work as a peacemaker.
There are so many, really. Let me give you, not just necessarily, there are biblical parallels to it, but I remember many, many years ago, something that had a profound impact upon me. I went to a World Council of Churches event in Bangkok in 1973. I was invited along with someone from the Catholic community to go to this World Council of Churches conference to try to help them to understand what was happening in Northern Ireland. Because at that time I was minister in the inner city, and so I was asked to go. And I was only a youngster really at the time, so I went along, and we gave papers from our different perspectives. And there were two things that happened, two things I heard, which were defining moments for me and set me on the course of life that I eventually traveled. One of them was a man who was a minister, a political minister in the government of Angola. And he talked about his journey from being a freedom fighter, a terrorist, to being a minister in the government of the country. And I remember coming back from that conference saying, you know what, I said to a journalist who interviewed me, told him about this, and the headline, and I have the paper somewhere here, that said, quoting me, "We've got to bring the gunmen to the table." Now that was not understood back in the 1970s in Northern Ireland. But the other thing, that this is the one I want to get back to your answering your more specific question, was a theologian called Jürgen Moltmann. Jürgen Moltmann, a very renowned German theologian, and he was a keynote speaker at this event. A lot of what he was talking about was above my head. He was very, very acclaimed theologian, and he spoke, but he ended up with this phrase. He ended up, and this is the one thing that I brought home with me, more important than anything else. He ended up by saying, "Never, ever let us forget that Jesus takes the inevitability out of history." Never, ever let us forget that Jesus takes the inevitability out of history. Now, there are many biblical texts that would say that in a different way, but that resonated with me to the extent that has kept me, held me, challenged me, led me, directed me in all that I've tried to do in my own small way, remembering that the one whom I serve, who in different ways said, "Don't ever forget that I am with you always," will take the inevitability out of history if you let me.
Thank you